Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Today's interview is with Zack Johnson of Sattler College. Zack was a few years into his military career when he became a convinced conscientious objector. I like this interview with Zack because I think a lot of our discussions this season have been philosophical and theological, which is great, but Zack is going to help us see the practical aspect of what it means to be in government, and particularly in the military. We get to discuss topics like the military, of course, as well as the early church, and poverty and violence. Zack also references quite a few resources, which I'm going to make sure to put in the show notes, along with some timestamps so you can easily jump around or come back to issues that pique your interest. So without further ado, here is the interview with Zack Johnson.
But yeah, so I was really excited to be able to get the opportunity to talk with you. There's not really that much to know about me. I'm very different than probably most of the other people in the group, because I'm Reformed. I go to a Reformed church, who aren't very nonviolent. My group, but I'm from Pennsylvania. My last name is Kreider, and I have a beard, so it seems like I should be Anabaptist.
Right. Yeah. I can sympathize with you. I don't call myself an Anabaptist. I came out of a very evangelical world, but I married my wife came out of that world, and so we attend the church called Followers of the Way out here in Boston. I don't know if you've heard of that church at all or not, but that's quick and dirty to my background there.
It was actually the Followers of the Way. I think the debate was called "It's Just War,"
right? Yep.
At Harvard. That was the video that kind of started me on this, because so I saw your video on, I think, Anabaptist Perspectives. You did an interview with them.
Yep.
So I watched that to cheat a little bit, get some background knowledge on you, and it sounds like your story is very similar. For as horrible as the 2016 election was in terms of what it showed me about my group, it also, I wouldn't be where I am today if that didn't kind of open my eyes to reality. And I've met a lot of other people, and it seems like you're one of those people who also was influenced by what you saw at that time. So that set the stage, that primed me. And so when a friend sent me that debate video, I was like, it's so stupid, nonviolence. Like it's just impractical. I'll go watch this one video because my friend sent it, and then I can just rebut everything and then just be on my way and have dealt with that issue. And the video just blew me away. And particularly when he brought up, the Nicene Creed, and I was like, wait, this stuff is in church history. And I went Reformed in part because my group was not steeped in church history. Like we were very, very modern. We didn't have any roots in church history. And I thought as a Reformed guy, I did. But I realized that basically our church history was Augustine, then Calvin, Luther, and so on. So that, sorry, this is an interview about you, not me.
No. It's good to know who I'm talking to. So I'm excited, and I'm excited that debate made an influence. I know I wasn't actually around when that was made, so that was before my day, but it also had a big influence on me. But I came to that later after, I bumped into Finney here in Boston, and then, he sort of just led the discipleship with me a little bit there. So.
Yeah. So because there's such a good interview with you on Anabaptist Perspectives, which I'll link, what I'd really like to do is, I want to let you kind of give a brief introduction to your story, but then I have a bunch of questions as to that might dig into a little bit more of the practical nature of what this looks like in the real world. So I'd like to, if you would just kind of do a brief introduction to your story, and then we'll dig in.
Yeah, great. I'll try to make it it's hard to condense a story in a quick amount of time, but I'll try.
Well, yeah, it doesn't have to. I mean, like the Anabaptist perspective is like 40 minutes. So if you can do 20 is good.
Yeah, I'll do that there then. My name is Zack Johnson. I'm currently the dean of students at Sattler College. It's a college startup in Boston. But the road to get here has been really interesting. So I was born and raised as a missionary kid in Quito, Ecuador. My parents were originally from Minnesota and went down with an organization called HEJB, that's Heralding Christ Jesus Blessings, to sort of pioneer Christian radio in Latin America. So that was the environment I grew up in. A lot of missionaries were following in the wake of guys like Jim Elliot and Nate Saint. I'm sure many of the listeners might be familiar with their story. So my family gave many tours of the house they grew up in, and it was sort of a real story to me that they're sort of the heroes of the community, the missionary community down there. And I won't get into like my entire 18 years down there, but I was there 0 to 18, and I think when I share my faith of Christ, I started taking my faith seriously probably when I was a junior in high school. I had sort of had a wake up moment there. But it's really interesting to graduate from high school in Ecuador. What they have everybody do is they have an oath to the flag. So to graduate, all the students get paraded in, and I was an Ecuadorian citizen, and they choose one of the citizens, and they hold the Ecuadorian flag. And I was sitting there while my classmates one by one came and said, "I swear to protect." In Ecuador, it's called patriotism or la patria. That I'll spend my life to protect this, defend it, XYZ. So all my classmates did that, and I did it. Paraded around, bent a knee, picked up the flag, kissed it. Well, fast forward 6 months, and I was joining the U.S. Air Force, renouncing my Ecuadorian citizenship. Really interesting there, where I graduated, took an oath to this flag, and then in order to join the Air Force, I had to renounce my Ecuadorian citizenship, and I took an oath. Basically, I went to a somewhere called the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. It's one of the military academies in the U.S. There are 4 different ones. There's sort of like a college program combined with commissioning into the military. Took another oath 6 months after that oath to the flag. And I like to sort of point out why people sort of don't pay attention to. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't even think about what I was doing realistically there. So I joined the military in a different structure. Spent 2 years there. It's a place in Colorado Springs. And then when I was there, my parents were still in the mission field. So I ended up visiting them one Thanksgiving, and they were down in Haiti. They had been moved to Haiti after Ecuador with an organization called Samaritan's Purse. And when I went and visited them there, that's when I was really aware of sort of my lack of church community and my lack of I'll just call it living a Bible-based life. So I was reading the Bible. I decided to get baptized in Haiti with my parents that year. And then when I came back, I was really disillusioned with the academy and sort of going to college, spending tons of time doing things I didn't really think was helping people. So then I left the Air Force Academy to go to Mozambique with Samaritan's Purse. So Mozambique is Southeast Africa. And so my passions are really development and the international world. But in Mozambique, it was really interesting because, I was there with a Christian organization, church, but I was churchless. So they sent me to the north part of the country. And I guess you could describe it. I was trying to do good, but I really didn't know what I believed about God or necessarily the Bible. And it was there that I actually seriously encountered somebody who challenged me as a follower of Jesus being in the military, because my plan was to go back to the academy. Initially, that was my plan. And he was actually a Quaker. And so that was actually one of the first times that somebody was like, "Hey, I don't think people who believe in the Bible should be using violence." I was kind of like, that's a weird thing to say. Almost never heard of it before. And spent my year there. And then at the end of that year, I tell a story where I was working at this hospital, and we were trying to reopen it after a flood. and there's a story of corruption where the food that was supposed to be going to the patients couldn't go there because the mayor of the town had sort of taken that and built a personal palace. And I was really angry, just like very angry, and being like, that guy needs to die. It was sort of my mentality, like justice needs to be served. And so that sort of just fueled me to go back gave me a lot of fuel to go back into the military. And I had this thing in mind, like part of doing good as a Christian is going to be to, systematically not eliminate evil by violence. That was sort of the picture I had in my mind. So I spent 2 years there, finished the academy out, and they sent me. I did really well at the academy. Fortunately, I was a very focused student. I got a scholarship from Harvard to come and train at a school called the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And so I moved right from Colorado to Boston here, and I had it in my mind that I was going to go be a guy that pointed lasers on targets running around the ground where the Air Force sort of drops bombs there. So that was what I was training for. But my passion started switching to being a military diplomat, because I started meeting a lot of international leaders where I was interacting here. And the Kennedy School produces a lot of international presidents and stuff like that. But that was in 2015 when I went there. And we were talking about this before. Being a Christian in the military and in the 2015, 2016 era, especially when I was taking classes from people who were really involved in politics, like their entire life was based on the political outcomes of the U.S. election. It was a really confusing time for me. I took a class with a woman named Megan O'Sullivan, who was on George Bush 43's cabinet, who led some of the efforts in Iraq. And I remember as a military member having this concept that in the U.S. that a Republican president had a team of prayer warriors who were, praying over the military outcomes, really connected to God and the Bible. And what was shocking to me was how secular I found out that the country, I think, is run. And I think I would confirm that too, that God is a little bit absent from the calculations of protecting U.S. interests. And I was just wrestling that at that election. I know you're familiar with this. It was Trump versus Hillary. And I was like, this is riddled with compromise. I don't agree with one person. I don't agree with the other person. And in 2 years, or at that point, in 6 months, I'll be going and I'll be killing in the name of whatever leader gets elected. And that I felt very, very, very hypocritical and lost. But a lot of people sort of gave me, assurances. They pointed me to scriptures, and Romans 13 is one of the big sort of guardians of being a Christian in the military, in terms of where I come from. But that's when I met a man named Finney Caravilla out here. I was actually just kind of crying my plights out to a chaplain through InterVarsity. That's a college ministry that kind of looks after Christians going to different academic institutions. He's like, you got to go meet this guy named Finney. He teaches a Greek class on Saturdays and then also leads an apologetics group. So that's when I met Finney, and I met him, was thoroughly impressed with his level of biblical knowledge, probably superseded any non-pastoral minister in biblical knowledge I'd ever met. And so I was like, I gotta go figure out what this guy is about. So I ended up visiting their church. And the first time I visited their church, somebody handed me a book named King Jesus Claims His Church. I highly recommend it, just as a sort of a snapshot into the church I attend out here and how it was founded. There's a chapter in there called Peacemaking and Non-Resistance. And it was the first time there's this really interesting question that I didn't even think about before, but I should have. Can a Christian kill another Christian? Is one of the questions I started to think about. Like, all right, in the system I'm a part of, I can't even control if I'm going to go kill another Christian, let alone, at that point, there was a war on terror in ISIS. So a lot of people don't really think about that question, like Christians killing Christians. When has that ever happened before? World War II is a great answer to that, but I'll stay out of all what I've discovered since then. And then that's when I really wrestled with, hey, the New Testament, and what does it say? And is my life in agreement with it? And very quickly, after reading through a little bit of church history, I found my life was at odds with especially what I thought Christ taught and how the early Christians lived it out. So I was convicted, and at that point I said, I will give everything to follow Christ, to be in a part of a system that will align with him. So I ended up going through a process called the conscientious objection process, and I won't tell all about that. There's stories after stories and about that, but ended up being released from the Air Force about 6 months later at no small cost. It was a lengthy process, and it was painful. All my relationships were ruptured. My entire worldview was switched. My future, a lot of debt sort of got pinned on. So I don't want to sweep over it as if it was nothing, because it really was a really interesting year of my life. And then, so the Air Force sent me to LA, where I worked as, lo and behold, a congressional analyst for Air Force's space program, where I handled a bunch of congressional inquiries into how the United States governs its space program. At that point, it was really interesting. The generals were talking about weaponizing space. I think we'll see that a little bit in the future. But then they let me go. I came and was on the team to start a college called Sattler College, where I work now, that's really passionate about, training people up in we call it the historic Christian faith, being, the faith that was once delivered, so that we can sort of sweep into various areas. And my passion here is peacemaking. That's sort of what I've been reading about a lot, is how can we take peacemaking to the next level that is on a Christ-centered model. Don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of thoughts. I think I did okay. That was 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And like I said, I'll link to that other interview where you can get more information, which I would recommend, because you don't want to gloss over that part where you could potentially owe $500,000. I mean, there's a huge cost to doing what you did, and I think that adds weight. It's not just something that you did lightly, for sure. So one of the first questions that comes to mind, because we talk a lot about Romans 13, and that's something that people bring up a ton. So why didn't the Bible's justification for government to use the sword, why is that so sufficient a reason for so many other people to be Christians? Because I think the last I saw was the Pew Research, it was 25 or 35% of the U.S. military are evangelicals, and I don't think that even includes Roman Catholics and others. Why wasn't that convincing for you?
I was extremely convinced of it when I went in, so I don't want to brush over that I didn't really believe in that. And there was actually a debate. You mentioned that you've watched a debate called "It's Just War: Can Christians Fight?" I actually organized a debate with followers of the way on the opposite side when I was still convinced I was in the right, and it's called "Can Christians Vote?" And that's a debate. That was a debate between a man named Matthew Milioni and I can't remember the other man's full name. His first name was Josh, and it was in that debate that I was listening to sort of the competing allegiances between, a stark contrast between Christ and the government of the world. And there's a notion that Romans 13 combines those, right? What Romans 13 has said is that the leaders of the world are God's ministers, and they use the sword to punish evil, and we don't have to fear them if we do good. The thing that really, I think, undid my understanding of Romans 13 was the simple contextual argument of Romans. So Paul wrote Romans, the book of Romans, and he was writing the book under, I'm sure you might know this, but it's good to know, under under the Roman Emperor Nero. All right, so Paul is writing this, Romans 13, about Nero. And if you know anything about Nero, Nero ends up being the very man who cuts Paul's head off at the end of his life. And that argument was really interesting to me to think about God's ministers not necessarily being good. And then you can actually do some interesting word studies on where that word is used, minister specifically. It also is used in Septuagint. Septuagint is just the Old Testament in Greek to describe people like Nebuchadnezzar. And so all of a sudden, throwing in the context to that started to unravel the Romans 13 argument. And then Romans 12, right before them, the conclusions to the Romans 12 is, if your enemy is hungry, give him something to eat. If your enemy is thirsty, give him something to drink, and which is echoing Jesus' call to enemy love. And so after taking Jesus seriously, I think it's just the shift to interpret Romans in light of what Jesus said, instead of interpreting what Jesus said in light of Romans. I hope that makes sense, but it's sort of a hermeneutic, right?
Yeah, and it kind of it makes me think when you talk about kissing the Ecuadorian flag, like it makes it so clear to me why, like in the United States, evangelicals in particular are very military minded, and so we conflate or we merge the American flag and the Christian flag,
right?
Because we know that we can only kiss one flag. Right, you can only be loyal to one, and so you have to blend the two in order to make military and state work. But it seems like the Bible separates the two.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I think that it's really interesting because the whole oath. I was in the military perspective, but there's another fundamental teaching called the doctrine of two kingdoms, where I think there's like this myth of the U.S. being a Christian nation. I call it a myth, but there's a strong belief, I say it's a myth now, that the U.S. is a Christian nation, that we are fundamentally Christian, and just examining that a lot and really being honest about that question, I think helped me a lot to think about Romans 13 there.
All right, so let me get kind of away from the theological question a little bit. And talk a little bit more practically for, like, let's say maybe people who are in the military or considering going in.
Right.
So if you've read through the early church and you probably know that if there was a soldier, a lot of times you'll see that the recommendation is, hey, look, if you're a soldier, you've taken an oath, you remain in that position, provided that you don't bow to the gods and you don't have to do harm to anybody. Do you feel like if there's somebody listening to this who's in the military, could you give that advice? Would you say, hey, look, remain where you are and then leave? And if you could give them that advice, why didn't you do that?
Yeah, this is my favorite thing to talk about. I've been working nonstop since I left, trying to get other people to leave who call themselves Christians, so that will frame where I'm gonna take this discussion. I do know the early Christians pretty well on this. There's a great book called Caesar and the Lamb. Highly recommend working your way through it, because it specifically goes about the first 300 years of the writing, specifically about the question of soldiers and oath taking. And I always point people to the story of a guy named Maximilian. He's the first documented conscientious objector, and he was 21 and he was getting recruited into the Roman legions. And he says, "I can't serve. I'm a Christian. I can't serve. I'm a Christian." And there's an amazing story about him going, and they're trying to convince him, right? Like, just serve. Like, stop saying this. Stop saying this. You're a Christian. You don't have to lose your life. Because at that point, if you rejected, it's called the Roman sacramentum, was the oath to the Roman government. If you rejected it, the consequences were having your head cut off. So it wasn't as grave as it is today. But there's a story of him. He rejects it. He was the first documented conscientious objector, gets his head cut off basically in front of his dad. And his dad, they hadn't really thought about it either. And his dad goes and studies, ends up studying the scriptures, and he says he counts it a joy that his son had his head cut off so that he could discover the truths of Christianity. So that's the first. And when I talk to people in the military, I share my story that when I applied as a conscientious objector, I said I can't use violence and I can't take oaths, were my two, because of Matthew chapter 5, if in the Sermon on the Mount. And I point people to Jesus's words there. And the military is so interesting to me because they said to me, we'll find somewhere for you to be in a nonviolent capacity where you're not using violence. That's fine. They were actually exploring roles for me. But the straw that broke the camel's back was that in the officer corps and in the enlisted corps as well, there's sort of these two different levels in the military. You have to take the oath every time on a consistent level, every time you promote. And so my promotion was actually coming up in the Air Force, and I did something where I refused to promote because I refused the oath. And so I was sort of frozen in a point of time because I wouldn't take the oath. So I was actually stripped of the promotion and the pay. And I point people to the oath of office as being the most significant thing. My most significant indication that you can't stay in the military under the oath you've taken when you pledge your allegiance to Christ. The oath goes something like this. I state your name, being appointed an XYZ in the military, will protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all foreign enemies, foreign and domestic. And there's this clause that says, I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I don't have it word for word here, that I will fulfill my duties to the best of my ability. And I look at people, I'm like, you can't say those words as a Christian. And if you do, your word it doesn't mean anything to you. That's where I try to get people to start thinking about, if they're convinced about the nonviolence piece. That's a whole nother piece in itself. But they kind of work together, right? That Jesus prohibits oath before he tells people about enemy love. And that's where my advice to guys in the military, there's a guy leaving the Air Force right now. He's about 95% of his way through. And it's once you are freed up to say, I won't bend my knee to any flag, but to any flag or system other than Christ, you end up feeling like so empowered as a Christian to know that you're sort of associating with the martyrs of old, that I would say that sort of reject this notion that somebody can tell you what Christ meant, or that Christ comes second depending on interest. So that's my short answer, is that before taking oaths, I would just study what was happening before and ask if it aligns with what Christ taught, given you're a committed Christian. If you're not a committed Christian, it's a harder argument to make. I've actually walked someone through the process for non-religious reasons, more just like moral reasons against violence as well. So I can talk about that a little too. But
well, that's really. I mean, I had like 5 other questions I was going to ask you, but you just kind of went down through them. So I want to kind of elaborate where I was headed and just make sure that I understand you correctly. Because my impression of the military before was, hey, look, the reason that I would have a problem going to the military is the violence. But then you think about it, and it's like, well, most people, I don't think, use violence or even are like directly involved, like loading the bombs on the planes. Most people don't have their hands in the violence. But the picture that you're painting, having to take an oath like every time you promote and all of that stuff, it seems like, or like, would you have to salute the flag or stand at attention, or were there certain requirements for the flag and that kind of stuff?
Oh yeah, I mean the U.S. flag in the military, it's like you get trained to treat that as if it's like I don't know, when it raises up, you stand at attention, salute it. When it comes down, you stand at attention, salute it. When it's walked into any ceremony, you stand at attention, salute it. So the flag is the flag is definitely, it's built into military culture that is your banner, and that you extreme amounts of respect to it and what it represents. And I don't want to like completely, and there are a lot of things represented by that flag that I think are good. Sacrifice is one of the huge ones that, like, how dare you disrespect something that so many people have died for, is a big argument. But yeah, it's built into everywhere in the military. And yeah, the answer to the question is yes, you're a ton of allegiance to the flag.
Yeah. So, because in the early church, like, doing violence was one of the big issues for why you avoid the military. And the other main thread, I mean, you could go to oath taking, but the other main thread is idolatry. Like, idolatry is a big problem. So one of the questions I was going to ask you is, I focus so much on violence, but is idolatry a big issue? And it seems like the way that I would assess it is, like, the way that you kind of elevate this symbol, this idea, this whatever, that seems pretty idolatrous to me.
Yeah, I'd agree. I agree with call it. There's not a great definition of idolatry that comes immediately to mind, but there's definitely an idolatry that you elevate the flag to the level of God. If I have time for a 5-minute, I have a spiel about this I talk about at the Air Force Academy, if you'd be willing to hear it.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of time. I don't know how much time you have.
Yeah, I've got some time. So at the Air Force Academy, I saw this come in really interesting, where there's something you should Google it sometime. The Air Force Academy Chapel. It's a really interesting looking building. So the chapel is the center point of the academy. It's like it looks down upon everything. So you look up at it, and that's where the place of worship is, right, to God. And there was a debate once that they were going to start something called the Center for Character and Leadership, and they were going to build an equally impressive structure next to the chapel. And it came in that some of the old guard said the chapel has to be the tallest point on the academy always. Really getting into this notion that that God is governing the operations here, right? That they really, that's really important for people to believe, especially, you mentioned it before, because of the number of Christians who are involved in the military. So if that is ever challenged, that God isn't involved at the top, you can imagine a ton of problems. But I like to talk to people about the word chapel and chaplain. So there's another really fun story that I like to talk about by another conscientious objector in the early Christians, called Saint Martin of Tours. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he's actually the Catholic saint for the homeless, really the soldier and the homeless. So there's a story about him that goes, he was in the Roman legions, and have you heard the story before?
Yeah, I have, but refresh my memory. And was Martin, I think one of these guys, like, isn't his day like November 11th, the day that we have Veterans Day?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe not. But the story goes, he's in the Roman legions as a soldier. I'm not sure exactly what. He rides his horse by a homeless person, and he looks down and he has compassion on him. He's like, this homeless person was not clothed. And so the story goes that he took his sword out and he cut what they used to wear, these capes called capellis. That word is important. I'll tell you why. So he cut half of his cape off and wrapped it around this homeless man. Later that night, supposedly, he had a dream where he saw a Christ. He knew about Jesus Christ clothed in his cape. So he goes on to see that, man, what I did there was actually a good moment. He ends up refusing to continue in the military after he has that dream, because he acknowledges that the military is incompatible with Christ. And so they actually threatened to put him on the front line of a battle with no weapon in consequence to his decision to leave. He ends up not having to do that. But that's actually where the word chapel and chaplain comes from, was Martin of Tours and his capelli, where he actually cut off his robe and refused military service. That's the origins of the word. And I always talk about, like, how interesting is it that the origins of the word chapel are nonviolent, and somehow they've made it their way to a place of, I would just say, idolatry is a good way to point it, and trying to maintain the notion that God is in control, when really I would strongly challenge the notion that God is in control of the military system. Anyway.
Yeah. No, yeah, and I would add that, so I just double checked, and St. Martin's funeral day is November 11th. That's when it's celebrated. So to add to the irony, November 11th was supposed to be Armistice Day, it's the celebration of peace. Martin of Tours is celebrated as a saint on November 11th, and we've turned it into Veterans Day, a celebration of the people who are willing to fight and kill.
Right. When he was the one that rejected it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's we co-opt things all the time. Yeah. Stanley Hauerwas talks a lot about the way that we co-opt different things and symbols and stuff. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that about chapel, so that's awesome.
Yeah, anyway, and I always talk about it because when you're in the military, there's a numbing of your morality, that I'll just call it a numbing of your morality, that you sort of trust. You look up at that chapel and you're like, all right, you're like, this is right. Like, God is here somehow, even though I don't know how, and I don't have to answer the hard questions because we're under God, right? That somebody else can deal with that. Maybe God himself.
Yeah. So another practical question that I have, so some of my best friends are in the military. Some of the people that I respect the most are in the military. But I've obviously come to see that Jesus' teachings on nonviolent it's not just true. It's not just like a secondary or tertiary doctrine. It's a central doctrine. But a lot of my friends are military or pro-military. A lot of people in my church, pro-Second Amendment, self-defense. Mm-hmm. But I struggle because if people in my church were living in adultery or in open lust, that would be something that they would be confronted about. And if confronted and there was a refusal to repent, then there would be a disassociation or excommunication, or some severe steps would be taken. So I really, really struggle because coming out of violent culture and being very pro Second Amendment, like I hope somebody breaks into my house because, we'll teach them. Like I understand the pragmatic aspect of it, the justice aspect of it. But it's a big deal. So how do you work through? Do you excommunicate all those people, or how do you work through disowning the 98%? I don't know the percentage, but like 98% of Christians who aren't nonviolent. Like, what do you do?
Yeah, this is a huge question, and I probably am not going to give the answer that maybe a straightforward answer. I'll talk about my story a little bit and how I think about it. When I was trying to sift through this decision to leave the military, I was part of a church part of a church is a strong word. I went there and was part of a small group. It's called Reunion. It's a Reformed church in Boston. And then I would go to Followers of the Way in the afternoon. They have an even more of a late afternoon service. And I was wrestling with this question, like, can I follow Jesus and be in the military? That was the question I was trying to answer, right? And I tried to meet with my pastor at the Reformed church, just like going over everything. I'd be like, I read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, was going over all the arguments in the early church, and he looked at me and he said, I don't think this church is the place for you. Honestly, he's like, I think you belong somewhere else. Like, you don't need to go here, which was hard to hear, right? Because I was looking for some ammunition to try to maintain some sort of place in the community that I had sort of been part of my whole life. Whereas Followers of the Way, I found out that they do communion we now do communion every week. And they told me, it came out that until I renounced my my until I renounced, my commitment to violence and my commitment to taking oaths in the military, that they wouldn't commune with me in the military. It wouldn't commune with me. And so that you mentioned the word excommunication. The origins of that word, when you look at them, are more about communion than they are about just being kind of a general member in the church. And that's where I think my shift as to what church is really started changing too. That church, everybody has to answer this sometime in their life. Is church a hospital for sinners, or is church a gathering of committed disciples? And so when you answer that, if you put violence and you mentioned violence and oath taking in the category of sins, then you as a person can't be in communion with somebody who is. And that's a really interesting and novel idea in the church I grew up in. But that's sort of what I tell people is you have to form the people you commune with people who are committed to Christ, as the early Christians did. And when somebody in the military wanted to join them, they'd say, you asked this before, they would say, renounce your position on violence and oath taking, and you're free to join us, and we'll support you in any way. But I also wanted to say that I know that some of you mentioned some of your best friends are in the military. Mine are as well. My entire world is. And it's not that I cut my relationship off with them, but it's that I stopped interacting with them in the capacity that we were both followers of Christ, communing together. Because I really do think this is where I look at churches and I'm like, if you don't teach Christ teachings, I don't know. I have a lot of problems, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, and why has that not become something we hold people to? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. I think adultery is one that people hold people to, but not all of them. So that my answer is really deciding that you're going to communion. You understand when I use the word commune, just bread in the cup and partaking in that moment. Some people call it the love feast. And that group of people being people that are following Christ the way that you understand. That's a hard answer, but it's closed. Some people call it closed communion. Some people call it close communion, that everybody's life enough, and that you actually communion, they have some teeth to it, that people who aren't following Christ, it wouldn't make sense for them to be there.
Yeah, no, I mean, hard answers don't mean that they're not right answers. So,
Right.
Yeah, that's very helpful, because I'm very averse to the way that my Christian community has worked. If somebody comes out in the past, my current community is not so much like this, but if somebody comes out as homosexual, it's like disown them. So I don't like the idea of disowning, but this is different. It's like, well, no, we'll be with you and we'll have relationship with you, but there's an inner circle. There's something that you can't get that close to because of where you're
Right.
at.
And I just want to encourage you as well. I mean, I tell everybody, if followers of the way had said, we'll commune with you while you're in the military, I would not have left the military. I would have been like, oh, I can have both. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if somebody wouldn't have called me out on my life not being in line with Christ, I think I would have kept going. And what I think is dangerous is that when churches don't elevate this to the level they should, I think they validate a lot of things and sort of just, they give people permission to exist in both worlds. And so I'm really glad that I bumped into that. I know not many people do, but that somehow there were some teeth like, hey, get your act together, or don't call yourself like a seeker, but not like a committed Christian until you've really committed to it. Anyway,
No.
I would just encourage that there's some power there as well.
No, it's good, and it stands in such stark contrast. The other Veterans Day, I was at my parents' church, and they go to a conservative church, and they I think they have flags, but then on Veterans Day they honored everybody. All the veterans stood up, and just thinking about
those two things are so opposed to each other, like refusing to serve those people who stood up communion versus honoring those people. It's
Right.
just, yeah.
And I think this is why I think the early Christians, if there's like, it's just reading them, their mentality is so different than than what you and I are probably used to. And they're really adamant that they're for the government. They're not against the government. They always make these arguments. Or there's a little section in a man named Origen. He's writing the letter is called Against Celsus, or I don't know how to say that. Maybe it's Celsus. It starts with a CE. But he's basically saying, like, Christians will be your most loyal servants. We will pray for you. We will hope for peace for you. We will pray against violence for you. And it's not that we're against the government. It's that we've just chosen Jesus as king, and we can't like compromise on his teachings. And so there is a stark contrast there. And I think some people, when they hear like, oh, you're not for the military, you must be against the military. And that's sort of a hard set of assumptions to work through, right? That I want everybody to leave the military and follow Christ. I'll just say that right now. I want everybody in the military to leave it, but I will pray for you while you're in there, and I'll pray for you to come to Christ, and I'll pray for you not to have to use violence and these things. Does that kind of make sense as well?
Yeah, and I think there's one by Tertullian as well who says something to the extent of, hey, look, we're not going to go out and fight for you, Emperor, but we'll pray for you while you go out and fight. And he's like, we're actually doing the more important job.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's hard to believe. I think the early Christians they believe better than I do. I'm working on it in the power of prayer versus the power of what I can do with my hands here in my lifetime. For
sure. So I've got one more set of questions if you still have time.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I enjoy this. I could do this forever. So you just let me know when you need to go. One of the things that was interesting about your story was you talked about how you went at one point. I think you took a break from the Air Force Academy, and you went out and you were divvying aid through the government. So I just finished a season on government, and it's hard for me to conclude that with me not doing violence, that I can participate in the government either through voting or through direct participation. But having worked in handing out aid as one aspect of your military role or government role, were there some good aspects as well as bad aspects that you were able to see about that? And do you think that, like, if we would withdraw from the military, because I know a lot of Christians sometimes would say, well, if all the Christians left government or if all the Christians left the military, look at all the good we do in the world, we wouldn't be able to do that. So yeah, what good did you see? What bad did you see? And do you think it would harm the world if Christians withdrew from that?
Yeah, the world of development aid, I don't want to claim that I'm the expert, but I spent, my family, they worked for Samaritan's Purse, I worked for Samaritan's Purse, and I studied it a lot. There's a great book called When Helping Hurts that wrestles through some of this. Have you heard of that book at all? And it talks a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly of Christians and aid. And I'm not saying that it's all bad. Giving people food and aid is good. But I think we really have to be honest with ourselves and where we spend our life's goals. And this is where I like to talk about the term human security. So if you ask like a pure, I'll use the word realist, just like a secular person, what is human security? They'll talk about safety and things like that. If you ask like someone called a realist, there's something called liberalism, not in terms of politics, but in more terms of international relations. They'll kind of say like, oh, equality is really human security, where we're all equals. I think the Christian really has to look at that question and take a really strong look at it. What is human security? maybe I'll ask you, you as a Christian, what is human security?
Oh man.
And you can there can be a theological lens to this too.
Yeah. So I guess I'll use a story to kind of tell you what I ideally think it should be. So we use catechism questions, and we were teaching our kids catechism.
Right.
And one day we were at the beach, and we were going to go out, but it started to storm. And so my daughter we told our kids we weren't going to go because it was dangerous. And my daughter said, well, why not? God will protect us. And we're like, she's already wrestling with the problem of evil at 4, or natural evil. And
Right.
so we were able to use the catechism, and says, well, does the catechism say that God will protect your life, your physical life? No. But what does it mean that God will protect you? Well, he'll preserve your soul. And so I guess the way that I would see human security is knowing that I can step out in faith to do the right thing, no matter the consequences, knowing that God preserves me in
Right.
some sense forever.
Yeah, and I like your answer a lot. That human security for the Christian, I would say, is more about soul security than it is about our physical security, right? That at the end of the day, that the soul is what we're fighting for here on earth. And what I think about aid, and my experience with it, is that if we manage to feed someone another day and even give them shelter, these are good things. I don't want to point fingers and say aid and development are bad, but if we fail to chase their soul, that's when I have sort of a big eye-opening moment where it's like, what's more important, their soul or their immediate physical needs? I don't want to ignore their immediate physical needs, but in terms of military aid and government aid, I worked on grant writing while I was part of Samaritan Spurs for USAID. USAID is the United States Agency for International Development. So if you ever get into the NGO world, you'll come across writing grants to get money to give to people. It's not getting at true human security if it's purely physical aid. And I think that the notion that just being able to give people food and help them in this life, I'm even going to go as strong as to say that even if you believe in, we have a worthy opponent here on earth called Satan, that's actually good for him, that he thrives when people think that the only security that matters is the physical security. And so I think that's the danger for it. And I'm passionate about aid and development as well. If your sole purpose is your human souls, does that make sense? There's a debate between, being a purist and a holist, and what we elevate more. And I would say over the course of time, I elevate more models that can disciple people into following Christ, as opposed to just doing good for them in terms of physical needs.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's the James aspect where you do want to help them, but there's a holistic approach to that where if you're only helping one aspect of a person, if you're not being a dualist, then if you're being a monist, then that's a problem.
Right. And I would even say, even in James and in Matthew, that I don't know where I fall in this, that the arguments is that the brothers in need are already within your church. Like the people who, especially the sheep and the goats, people say, anyone who does the least of these, my brethren, that there might be an indication that Jesus is talking about the church. Like the church is definitely, if there are people needy among our own, that intimate group among us, then there's a huge problem that we need to figure that out. And then that ripples out into the world, like you indicated in James there.
Yeah, and it seems like, so when Helping Hurts is very big on, you help people within your community, because that's where you have relationships, and that's where you're going to be able to work with body and soul,
Right.
and recognize real needs. The way that
my group, I saw my group using that book. So I had a really bad taste in my mouth for When Helping Hurts, which in retrospect, now that I've been able to even out, I think it says good things, but I think it can be used terribly, because the way that my group used it was, oh, well, those poor people, because we're a pretty affluent church. The Reformed denominations tend to be more affluent as
Right.
well. We're pretty affluent, and we'd see poor people and we'd be kind of like, well, When Helping Hurts says we help people in our community, they're not in our community, so I guess we
Right.
can't help them. As opposed to figuring out, well, how do I become a part of their community? Like, do I go live in their community? Do I,
Right. And the quippy one-liner from that book is that we've gotten really good at giving relief when development is needed. So like we feel really, and their chapter on short-term missions, I think is one of my favorite chapters, where the solution to long-term problems can't be quick and easy solutions about giving food, giving a Band-Aid here, taking a 3-week mission trip to XYZ country, and then coming back to the US and never doing anything again. That it's rooted, you said, being part of their community. The change is rooted in permanence, and that if we're going to go do aid, I hope we don't do it in short-term stints, that we're really sold out for it and we're in it for the long haul. That's why I like that book.
Yeah, that's why incarnation for me has become a word that I reflect on a lot, because, to become part of somebody's community, you need to incarnate, and
right.
That's the hard work of that long-term stuff. So I also want to ask you, my experience. So prior to the 2016 election, I was working on our church's diaconate, read When Helping Hurts, and started dealing with the Matthew 5 issues of giving to the beggar, or the Sermon on the Mount, giving to the beggar, and some of those hard things. And I realized, wow, we're not doing this in regard to poverty. And so that primed me then for the 2016 election and all of that stuff. It was interesting because I was listening to a different podcast, and somebody else who had gone to live in slums in Asia somewhere, he was saying that he wasn't a pacifist going in, and most of the people that he knew weren't. But he said it's amazing how many people come out of working with the poor as being nonviolent. And he said that a part of that he thinks is because when you see poverty, you recognize, like you did, where you see, oh, that guy is funneling aid, or you see, oh, these people are poor because my country was here earlier and we exploited these people, or we might be exploiting them now in sweatshops. Like, the poor are oppressed by violence, and by violence of our own country and violence of the rich. Did your work with the poor or with aid, did that have any influence on, other than obviously talking to the Quaker nonviolent guy, but did your work with aid and poverty have any impact on your move to nonviolence?
The answer to this is no, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of my friends believe this too. It's interesting that they wear two different hats. They wear one hat in the military, and they take that off, and then when they go do their other ministerial work, or whatever you want to call it, service work, that now they wear the Christian hat. And in that capacity, they wouldn't use violence. They wouldn't be a violent person. They're sort of loving everybody. And that's the answer. Like, when I was over working with the poor, I wasn't going to use violence. I wasn't armed, and so I'm not even thinking about violence in that capacity. And so there's a kind of like I can operate in one capacity here and another capacity here. And that's why it didn't really get me thinking about violence, because I thought that I could just like live two different lives there and not have everything lumped together. On what you're saying with working in slums on poverty, there's I'll just throw out another a book called The Locus Effect. A guy named Gary Haugen. He's the CEO or the founder of International Justice Mission. He has a really interesting thesis that how much that the world is paying a lot of attention to poverty, but not that I agree with his conclusion, but he says that poverty will never go away until violence goes away, and that violence is actually he calls it the locus effect, the hidden driver to a lot of poverty. And his solution is sort of functioning justice systems that rid the world of violence. It's an interesting book, though, to think about how violence is tied to poverty, because I really do think it is.
So what you said about the living in two worlds, that resonates a lot with me, because I would have said the same thing, and it's something you see. So the irony from your story is you have a family who is down in Ecuador, and Nate Saint and Jim Elliott are revered. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they had a gun with them when they were attacked, right?
They did.
So they, as far as we know, they essentially chose to lay down their lives instead of shoot.
They brought a gun with them, but they chose nonviolence they knew that if they were to use that gun, they would have no hope in their whole mission.
Yeah. So the irony to me is, like, you're down there and you've got all these people who revere these people who laid their lives down in nonviolence because they recognize the importance of that religiously, spiritually. And then we send so many of our people and we encourage and we lift up the state, which is a violent institution. There's just, we bifurcate that where we, I'm just rambling, but I mean, it's one of those things that it made sense to me before, but now just splitting it up and saying, well, if you're in a missionary context, as if my whole life is in a missionary context and displaying Christ.
Right. And that's the other, we could talk all day on this. The other dangerous part of the affiliation to the Romans 13 understanding is I think people really do think they have top cover under working for a government. And this is where I would call people to just a life of pure integrity with no compromise in anything you do as a Christian. I think that's kind of where Christ is trying to push us. Like, let your yes be yes and your no be no. He's saying you can never be deceitful. And when I look at the military system, I was working on a small project where we were trying to evaluate our allies' air forces and it was really interesting where the program was trying to say, how do we keep people at the level that we want them at? So really interesting that our allies, the program was trying to say, how do we, get our allies right up to the point where they're where we want them, but not too far up? And how do we prevent people who are enemies from being down there? What I ended up seeing is that we lie. There's a bunch of deception involved in the intelligence world. And I think we know that. That's not a surprise to you, right? And then I started thinking to myself, like, why is it that people are okay with lying in this capacity, but as soon as you're in your private world, then you're not expected to lie because you're not protecting the state's interests and those kinds of things. And it's that kind of thinking I think is Christ is just trying to cut down. He's like, no, there's like, I'm the king. You don't get to sort of live in these two worlds. And I agree with all your sentiments that we bifurcate, but we shouldn't. My plea is just for people to live a solid, stable, Christ-following lives, regardless of what their positions are.
Yeah, and that's what, like with the 2016 election, what it revealed to me was, John Howard Yoder kind of fleshed it out for me, which was consequentialism, right? So the ends justify the means. If we think that government is the arm of power in the world, then we can sacrifice morality to it, because really we're sacrificing a lesser morality for some greater good. And then I began to just see it everywhere, like you said, with lying, with violence.
Yeah, and I'll just give a shout out. I always say, don't take my word for it. To people, like, go read some of the early Christians, and I think it's really illuminating to see that they're not using the same chains that have sort of crept in to what I was raised with and what you might have been raised with. And I think it's so comforting to go and sort of being like, hey, I align with I align with the early Christians. The disciples of the disciples is what I like to say, and I think that's the place in history that I want to be, is on that side of history. I hope you do too, and anyone who's listening.
So I'll ask you. I have one last question that I have written down, and I'll throw it out. And you're welcome to stick around, and we can talk more if you have anything you want to talk about. But this is the last listed one that I want to make sure to get to. One of the, when I advocate that government just isn't a place that Christians ought to be, and I don't know if you agree with that. I know you agree with the military is a problem.
I'd say there are places in government that don't involve, I use the word entanglement, but if there are any ethical implications that you don't you don't belong there. And I could, yeah.
So like the post office, or maybe like a teacher, depending on your role as a teacher.
Okay. Yeah, even like USAID, the agency I described before, I wouldn't point and be like, that's all wrong anyway.
Okay. So
or trash collector, there's a bunch of
But by and large, most positions that I think our group would find, or not your group anymore, but my group still, and our old groups would find useful in the world, or powerful, or able to make a difference as far as we can see it, those would be kind of off the table. How do you avoid accusations of ineffectiveness and retreatism? Like you're just letting the world go to hell in a handbasket, and you're not really doing anything effective in the world.
Yeah, my favorite resource on this question, it's a book called To Change the World by a guy named James Hunter. And he gets at this question in a lot of different ways. And he does a study on Christians interacting with world change. And he finds that for the most part, when people aim at promoting change in the world as Christians, they turn to political solutions. And so, this is the answer that's crept into, I'll just say a broad stroke, the American Christian church, is that if we want to affect big change, we turn to politics. And then he does a really interesting examination of what have the results been here, and looking at, he examines culture as a result of, all right, if we really want to change things, we should be seeing it in the culture. And I point back at people and said, the political solutions to the problems that we care about has failed. And that basically saying, how is it that, I think however many Americans, I don't know the exact statistics, say that there's some form of Christian, but that their lives don't prove it. And so I like to point back at people and say, we have failed as Christians. I think many of us could agree that a lot of our culture is secular. The media is secular. The politics are secular. The music is secular. The dominant forces in this country are sort of anti what Christ taught. And I try to say, hey, if you really want to change things, you got to pull out and put your eggs in the church basket, where if you want to change culture, you got to do it through a way that is different than what's not been working. And I think I can go toe to toe with people pretty in a lot of ways on how they think it might be ineffective or a cop out. But I think there's equally as relevant results that the church has had over time. The church being the pure church, not necessarily the church and state model. But that book itself really changed my thinking on this, that really to change the culture, politics hasn't worked. And we've actually, as Christians, we've failed if you look at the trend of culture versus our answers to it, and that we're failing as Christians to sort of try to have the outcomes that we're aiming for. I hope that answer makes sense.
And yeah.
And it's more of a like, I don't have the perfect solution, but I know what you're trying isn't working is sort of my answer to that question. So we should be trying something else.
And I think what I saw in 2016 was people realized that what we were doing wasn't working. And so people like us were like, oh yeah,
that's because it's not the right thing. We're not doing the Christian thing. But so many in my group went the other way and said, yeah, that means we have to do it harder and work harder.
And I think, I don't want to decry, I think there can be some good political outcomes that I like to talk about. There is a little bit of, you can make the world a little better by being involved in politics, right? And in some metric, I like to talk about immigration. I'm still a big, when I think about like political issues, I love to think about immigration. Like my mom passed away, and my dad's remarried to an Ecuadorian lady right now, and she still can't get into the country. So it's really interesting to me that if we, as the Christian church, wanted to get the gospel of the kingdom to the nations, it'd be really good if the borders opened up. We could train everyone here, send them back to where they came from on their own turf. Voila, we no longer need foreign missionaries. But that's another argument there,
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. We have friends who were going to do missions in Greece, and some of our churches, some of our like really conservative churches were like, oh, that's so awesome because there are so many refugees and you'll have such an opportunity to reach out. But then we knew that these same people were so anti-immigrant. And you're like, oh, you're okay with that over there, but you don't want it here.
Right. And my point being that I do think good can come out of political decisions. And I'm not saying it can't, but it shouldn't be where we just like zone in on how we're going to change things. I think Christians can pray for good outcomes that political leaders make for us, but it's not our sole responsibility as followers of Christ.
This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.